Some of the complaints undoubtedly arise from postural strains and lighting defects and the notoriously ill-designed work areas where many VDTs are used. It could be prevented by more frequent breaks and some sympathetic attention to human engineering. The birth defects and cataracts probably won't disappear so easily, however, certainly pregnant women should be allowed temporarily reassignment without loss of pay, a right already accepted in much of Western Europe and recently put into law in Ontario. That won't protect sperm cells and unfertilized eggs, however. Regular maintenance and lead impregnated glass or acrylic screen, such as used in nuclear power plant windows, can virtually eliminate ionizing radiation. But screen-generated microwaves require a transparent shield that still conducts electrical energy, a product that doesn't yet exist. Some frequencies of EMR are easily to block simply by using metal cabinets instead of cheaper plastic ones. But VLF and ELF waves require grounded shielding. All these preventative measures are expenses that most manufacturers and managers have been loath to accept. Until they do, workers will be paying the entire price. The dangers of electropollution are real and well documented. It changes, often pathologically, every biological system. What we don't know is exactly how serious these changes are for how many people. The longer we as a society put off a search for that knowledge, the greater the danger is likely to be and the harder it will be to correct. Meanwhile, one of the few honest statements to emerge from the Nixon administration, a warning issued by the President's Office of Telecommunications Policy in 1971, continues to bleed through the whitewash. The population at risk is not really known. It may be special groups. It may well be the entire population. Consequences of undervaluing or misjudging the biological effects of long-term low-level exposure could become a critical problem for the public health, especially if genetic effects are involved. The establishment attitude towards EMR health effects derives largely from the work of Hermann Schwann, an engineer who had been a professor at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Biophysics in Germany during most of the Nazi era. Schwann was admitted to the United States in 1947, soon accepted a post at the University of Pennsylvania, and since then has done most of his research for the Department of Defense. Like infrared radiation, radio waves and microwaves produce heat when they're absorbed in sufficient quantity. Although not a biologist, Schwann assumed this heating was the only effect EMR would have on living tissue. In this respect, he considered living things no different from hot dogs that World War II radar men used to roast in their microwave beams. So cooking was the only harm he foresaw. Schwann then estimated danger levels based on how much energy was needed to measurably heat metal balls in beakers of salt water, which he used to represent the size and presumed electrical characteristics of various animals. Appreciable heating occurred in these models only at levels of 100,000 microwatts or above. So incorporating a safety factor of 10, Schwann in 1953 proposed an exposure limit of 10,000 microwatts for humans by showing soon afterward that it took more than this intensity to cause burns in real animals. Saul Michelson seemed to have confirmed the safety of non-thermal dosages. No one tested for subthermal effects, and the 10,000 microwatt level was uncritically accepted on an informal basis by industry and the military. In 1965, the Army and Air Force formally adopted the Schwann limit, and a year later, the industry-sponsored American National Standards Institute recommended it as a guideline for worker safety. More persuasive economic reasons why the 10,000 microwatt standard was and still is defined at all costs. Lowering it would have curtailed the expansion of military AMR use and cut into the profits of the corporation that supplied the hardware. The reduced standard now would constitute an administration that the old one was unsafe, leading to liability for damage claims from XGIs and industrial workers. One of the strongest monetary reasons was given in a 1975 classified summary of the DoD's Tri-Service Electromagnetic Radiation Bioeffects Research Plan. These lower standards will significantly restrict the military use of EMR in a peacetime environment and require the procurement of substantial real estate around ground-based EMR emitters to provide buffer zones. The needed real estate was estimated to be 498,000 acres. The price of this much land would surely run well into the billions of dollars. Even before it was adopted, there were indications that the standard might be inadequate. During the obligatory fight for compensation in the face of callous official denials of responsibility, an interesting discovery was made by Thomas Montgomery, a former civilian technician working for the Army Signal Corps, who's now blind, deaf, and crippled because of a massive accidental exposure to radar beam in 1949. In one of the files opened by his suit, Montgomery found a document proving that in the late 1940s, Institute of Radio Engineers had formulated more conservative safeguards that included methods for preventing accidents like the one that had incapacitated him. He'd been repairing a transmitter when a coworker, not knowing what he was standing in front of, a waveguide, turned it on. Since microwaves were imperceptible, Montgomery didn't know he was being irradiated until it was too late. Leaders of the military industrial electronics community chose not to promulgate these proposed regulations. There were other hints that all was not well. In 1952, Dr. Frederick G. Hirsch of the Sandia Corporation, a maker of missile guidance systems, reported the first known case of cataracts in the microwave technician. The following year, Bell Laboratories, alarmed by reports of sterility and baldness among its own workers as well as military radar personnel, suggested a safety level of 100 microwatts, 100 times less than Schwann's. Even Schwann has consistently maintained that this dosage limit probably isn't safe for more than an hour. In 1954, a study of 226 microwave exposed employees at Lockheed's Burbank factory was reported by company doctor Charles Barron. He said there were no adverse side effects, despite paradoxical and difficult to interpret changes in white cell and blood cell counts, which he later ascribed to laboratory error, as well as high incidence of eye pathology, which he determined was unrelated to radar. However, the safety standard has already become a procrastination bed against which all research proposals and findings were measured. Grants weren't given to look for low-level hazards, and scientists who did find such effects were cut down to size. Funds for their work were quickly shut off, and vicious personnel attacks undermined their reputations. Later, when undeniable biological changes began to be noted from power densities between 1,000 and 10,000 microwatts, the idea of differential heating, hotspots in especially absorptive or poorly cooled tissue, was advanced, as though this convenient explanation obviated all danger. Soviet research could easily be discounted because of its crudity. But when non-thermal dangers were documented in America, military and industrial spokespeople simply refused to acknowledge them, lying to Congress and the public. Many scientists who naturally wanted to continue working went along with the charade. The pattern was exactly the same as one regarding fallout dangers from nuclear weapons tests. Throughout the 1950s, there was no cause for alarm. But 20 years later, the Wyoming sheep ranchers' suit for compensation for fallout damage herds unearthed documents proving the responsible officials had known better at that time. Even the symbol of American military machismo may have fallen victim to the policy. John Wayne, as well as Susan Hayward and other cast members, died of cancer about 2 decades after making a movie called The Conqueror, which was filmed in the Nevada desert while an unexpected wind shift sifted radioactive dust down on them from a nearby test. Today, the EMR deceit still proceeds. On August 2nd, 1983, Sol Michelson was quoted as saying some bioeffects have been observed in animals and a few claimed in humans from intensities under 10,000 microwatts, but none of these effects, even if substantiated, could be considered hazardous or relevant to man, even though 3 years before he co-authored a paper that reviewed previous evidence and added some of his own support in support of the generalized stress response from microwaves. The evidence had begun to come in over 20 years previously. John Heller's 1959 finding of chromosome changes in irradiated garlic sprouts and the 1964 John Hopkins correlation of Down syndromes with parental exposure to radar were mentioned in the previous section. In 1961, a study was conducted on a strain of mice bred to be specially susceptible to leukemia and used to evaluate risk factors for that disease. 200 mice, all males, were dosed with 100,000 microwatts at radar pulse frequencies for 1 year. An unusually high proportion of the animals, 35%, developed leukemia during that time, and 40% suffered degeneration of the testicles. Admittedly, this was a very high power density, but the mice were exposed for only 4 minutes a day. The most disturbing part, however, is that the sponsor, the Air Force, cut off all funds for follow-up work. And American research has adequately addressed this potential danger. In 1959, Milton Surratt, an ophthalmologist from Scarsdale, New York, began a study for the Air Force to see if there was any special risk to the eyes of radar maintenance men. He at first found none because he geared the examinations to check the lens of the eye. A few years later, when several private companies referred to him microwave workers who'd developed cataracts, Surratt saw he made a mistake because the microwaves penetrated deeply into tissue. Cataracts from them had developed behind the lens. In the posterior capsule or rear part of the elastic membrane surrounding the lens. At this point, the Air Force again suddenly lost interest, but Surratt had doggedly pursued the matter in his own practice. Although military and industry people still deny that non-thermal microwave cataracts exist, Surratt's work has proven beyond good faith dispute that low doses exist a cumulative effect that eventually stiffens and clouds the posterior capsule. Surveys by others here and abroad have confirmed his conclusion. In fact, these behind the lens cataracts constitute a marker disease for sustained microwaves exposure. Surratt has personally diagnosed over 50 clear-cut cases, many in airline pilots and air traffic controllers. In 1971, Surratt was involved in projected 5-year primate study for the Navy when he made the mistake of telling his overseers the disturbing news that one of the monkeys had died after a few hours exposure to just twice of the U.S. safety level. Within days, Captain Paul Tyler happened to be in the area of the Hawaii Research Facility and wanted Surratt to show him around. He left in about 20 minutes, having seen little of the equipment, and in a few days more, the entire project had been canceled. The double dealing has only made Surratt dig in his heels. Through the years, he has been one of the few doctors willing to take on government by testifying on behalf of plaintiffs filing claims for microwave health damage. In such proceedings, one always runs into the same cast of characters speaking more or less the same lines. At one trial, the ubiquitous Michelson attacked Zerett's professional abilities, only to have later testimony revealed the embarrassing fact that Michelson's mother owed the vision in one eye to the ophthalmologist's surgical skill. As we've already seen, there are many indications that EMFs and EMR weaker than the Schwann guideline have serious effects on growth. 10,000 microwatt level was directly tested in the 1978 by a group at Stanford Research Institute. Pregnant squirrel monkeys and their offspring were irradiated. Of 9 babies zapped in utero and or after birth, 5 have died within 6 months, compared with none in the control group. The U.S. safety standard would be grossly inadequate even if it was law. In actuality, although some businesses and military agencies have adhered to it, it has never posed any threat to those that have not. A federal court case decided in 1975 and upheld in 1977 defined it as an advisory or should guideline, which couldn't be enforced. Now, as per instructions dated March 17, 1982, Occupational Safety and Health Administration inspectors can no longer issue even meaningless citations to companies for exposing workers to more than the limit. The only actual regulation for public electromagnetic energy dosage pertains to microwave ovens. In 1970, the FDA Bureau of Radiological Health stipulated that no oven should leak more than 1,000 microwatts at a distance of 2 inches when new, nor more than 5,000 after sale. Even at that time, research suggested this was an unsafe level, a fact recognized by Consumers Union in 1973 when it recommended against the purchase of any brand. Leakage surveys have shown that all types put out an average of 120 microwatts near the door, while many emit much higher amounts. A worn seal or piece of paper towel stuck in the door can increase the user's exposure to well over 5,000 microwatt level, according to Consumer Union test. What amount of electromagnetic energy do workers and general public actually absorb? The levels vary greatly. Some antenna repairers receive up to 100,000 microwatts for minutes or hours during a job. Many factory workers are in the same bracket. From 1974 to 1978, NIOSH surveyed 82 industrial plastic molders and sealers, over 60% exposed to the operator to more than the Schwann limit, some to over 260,000 microwatts. Because of low wages for such work, nearly all sealer operators are women of childbearing age. NIOSH has estimated that some 21 million workers are exposed to some levels of radio frequency waves or microwaves as a direct result of their jobs. No metal shielding is provided for most workers in this country, although it's sold to other nations having better safety rules. At this time, there's no way to estimate how much EMR people are getting away from their jobs, because the few readings that have been taken have measured only single sources and single frequencies. No one has yet surveyed our cities and countryside through the whole spectrum from ELF to microwaves. All we know is that most people's daily exposure is high. Even the Environmental Protection Agency has estimated that if the Soviet off-the-job safety limit of 1 microwatt in the radio and microwave bands was adopted here, over 90% of FM stations would have to be shut down. Table 1 power density at various distances from a 50,000 watt AM radio station. Most city dwellers continuously get more than 1/10 of microwatt from television microwaves alone. This may be especially significant because of the human body's resonance frequency. This is the wavelength to which the body responds as an antenna. Next to the ELF range, it perhaps the region of the spectrum in which the strongest bioeffects may be expected. The peak human resonant frequency lies right in the middle of the VHS television band. Many people live in zones of higher than average risk. Levels rise steeply from 1 microwatt within half a mile of most radio stations. Near antenna farms like the Forest of Transmitters on Mount Wilson on the outskirts of Los Angeles, the densities can reach well into the thousands. They regularly go up about 7 microwatts near microwave relay towers, which are often placed in the center of towns. Exposure to 100 microwatts is not uncommon with half a mile of military or airport radar towers. Office workers in tall buildings are often in direct line with microwave beams, whose intensities may reach 30 to 180 microwatts, as measured in a recent EPA survey. CB radios and walkie-talkies bombard users, especially their heads and chests, with thousands of microwatts. These figures, of course, represent only single sources, not the total exposure. Microwave exposure from walkie-talkie. Although most people's absorption doesn't approach the Schwann guideline, it should be clear by now that the lower levels are little cause for comfort. Everywhere in Western nations, except in the most remote forests or deserts, the ambient energy from ELF power systems in several thousand times above the Earth's background field strength, providing abundant interference with the biocycle timing cues. Moreover, the accumulated research has clearly shown that small doses often have the same effect as larger ones. Ross 80, who has intensely studied the window effect, in which a certain result and produced at some frequencies of power levels but not at others interspersed between the effective ones, believe future research will reveal such windows at much lower levels, even at fractions of a microwatt. Indeed, there has already been one report of brainwave changes suggesting resonance of neural electrical currents with radio waves and microwaves down to a billionth of a microwatt. There's a chance of somewhat stricter rules in a few years. In 1982, the American National Standards Institute recommended that the radio wave safety level to be lowered to 1,000 microwatts and the microwave level to 5,000. This was the first semi-official admission that the non-thermal effects do exist. Now, several federal agencies have begun discussing a formal regulation. The most likely source is the Environmental Protection Agency. But at last report, the rumored EPA proposed a 100 microwatt limit for the general public, in which had been anticipated in 1984, were abruptly and indefinitely postponed due to dissension within and pressure from outside the agency. A health protecting federal standard with the force of law would have a major impact on both industry and government. Industry would experience a decline in revenue and an increase in costs. Government, especially the military, would be inconvenienced in a multitude of activities. Both would be subject to lawsuit for exposures and damages prior to establishment of the standard. In addition, we must understand that no amount of artificial EMR, no matter how small, has been proven safe for continuous exposure. Bioeffects have been found at the lowest measurable doses. However, we must also understand that the greatest danger lies in uncontrolled exposure to large amounts of EMR at many overlapping frequencies, and therefore a stringent standard with a definite timetable for phasing it in this only way to protect the public health. Moreover, such action must come from Washington. New Jersey and Connecticut have recently adopted the ANSI standard, while in 1983, Massachusetts enacted a much stricter one of 200 microwatts, which large areas of New York City already exceeded considerably. Some communities recognize that even a 100 microwatt level is too high, are beginning to set their own lower ones. Without realistic federal regulation, we will end up with a totally unworkable patchwork. Suppose, for example, that Air Force from a base outside of town operates a radar dome that produces illegal EMR levels inside it. Without federal direction, that will become one more confused legal issue to be hammered out for years in already overburdened courts. All of the industrialized West is locked into false position on electropollution's risks. It's these countries that have been made the maximum use of electromagnetism for power, communications, and entertainment. The Soviet Union and China, partly due to underdevelopment and wartime destruction, and partly by choice, have severely limited its use and exposure of their civilians. Soviet scientists have consistently assumed that any radiation that doesn't occur in nature will have some effect on life. We've consistently made the opposite assumption. Throughout our recent history, American regulators have followed a dead body policy. They have extended no protection until there was proof of harm sufficient to overcome all deception. There's no longer any question that, as far as electromagnetic energy is concerned, we've been wrong and the Soviets have been right. In the 1950s, Russian doctors conducted extensive clinical exams of thousands of workers who had been exposed to microwaves during the development of radar. Having disclosed serious health problems, these studies were swept under the rug. Instead, the USSR set limits of 10 microwatts for workers and military personnel and 1 microwatt for others. Both levels are strictly enforced. When this first became known in the West in early 1960s, instead of checking their assumptions, many American scientists and administrators chose to believe this was Russian propaganda aimed at embarrassing us. In 1971, when they presented their work at momentous conference in Warsaw, Zenaida Z. Gordon and Maria N. Sadachokova of the USSR Institute of Labor Hygiene and Occupational Diseases had identified a comprehensive series of symptoms which they called microwave sickness. Its first signs are low blood pressure and slow pulse. The later and most common manifestations are chronic excitation of the sympathetic nervous system, stress syndrome, and high blood pressure. This phase also includes headache, dizziness, eye pain, sleeplessness, irritability, anxiety, stomach pain, nervous tension, inability to concentrate, hair loss, plus an increased incidence of appendicitis, cataracts, reproductive problems, and cancer. The chronic symptoms are eventually succeeded by a crisis of adrenal exhaustion and ischemic heart disease, blockage of coronary arteries, and heart attack. The Soviet standards were set long before the dangers were this clear. However, the comparison is instructive. At 1969 International Symposium of Microwaves in Richmond, Virginia, Dr. Carol Mara of Prague's Institute of Industrial Hygiene defended his findings on birth defects and recommended that the Eastern European standard be adopted in the West. Replying to objections that the dire predictions hadn't been proven beyond doubt, he said, "Our standard is not only to prevent damage, but to avoid discomfort in people." Apparently, this concern doesn't include Americans, for the Soviets have been bombarding our embassy in Moscow with microwaves for some 30 years. In 1952, at the height of the Cold War, there was a secret meeting at the Sandia Corporation in New Mexico between US and USSR scientists, allegedly to exchange information on biological hazards and safety levels. It seems the exchange wasn't completely reciprocal, or perhaps the Americans didn't take seriously what the Russians told them. There have been other joint workshops since then, and each time the Soviets have sent people who publicly acknowledged the risk, while the American delegates have always been no effect men. At any rate, soon after the Sandia meeting, the Soviets began beaming microwaves at the US Embassy from across Tchaikovsky Street, always staying well within the Schwann limit. In effect, they've been using embassy employees as test subjects for low-level EMR experiments. The strange thing is that Washington has gone along with it. The Moscow signal was apparently first discovered about 1962, when the CIA is known to have sought consultation about it. The agency asked Milton Zarrett for information about microwave dangers in that year, and then hired him in 1965 for advice and research in a secret evaluation of the signal called Project Pandora. Nothing was publicly revealed until 1972 when Jack Anderson broke the story. And the US government told its citizens nothing until 1976 in response to further news stories in the Boston Globe. According to various sources, the Russians shut off their transmitter in 1978 and 1979, but then resumed their irradiation for several months in 1983. According to the information given Zarrett in the 1960s, the Moscow signal was composite of several frequencies, apparently aiming for a synergistic effect from various wavelengths, and it was beamed directly at the ambassador's office. Thus, it may have been used at least partially to activate bugging devices, but it wasn't consistent with one of the other subsequent official American explanations: a jamming signal to disrupt the US eavesdropping equipment on the embassy roof. The intensity isn't known for certain. When the State Department admitted the signal's existence, officials claimed that it never amounted to more than 18 microwatts. However, although released Project Pandora records don't directly reveal a high level of relevant documents have allegedly been destroyed, research protocols aiming at simulating the Moscow signal called for levels up to 4,000 microwatts. In the mid-1960s, published Soviet research indicated that such beam would produce eye strain, blurred vision, headaches, and loss of concentration. Within a few years, other research had uncovered the entire microwave syndrome, including the cancer potential. By all accounts, except the official ones, the Moscow bombardment has been highly effective. In 1976, the Globe reported that Ambassador Walter Strausel had developed a rare blood disease similar to leukemia and was suffering headaches and bleeding from the eyes. Two of his irradiated predecessors, Charles Bolin and Llewellyn Thompson, died of cancer. Monkeys exposed to the signal as part of Project Pandora soon showed multiple abnormalities of blood composition and chromosome counts. In January 1977, the State Department, under duress, announced results of a series of blood tests on returning embassy personnel, slightly higher than average white blood cell count in about a third of Moscow staff. If 40% above the white blood cell count of other foreign service employees, levels common to incipient leukemia can be considered slightly higher than average, then this technically wasn't a lie. The finding has been officially ascribed to some unknown microbe. Unfortunately, there's no such doubt about the veracity of explanations about some earlier research. As part of Project Pandora in the late 1960s, the State Department tested its Moscow employees for genetic damage upon their return from stateside, telling them the inner cheek scrapings were to screen for those unusual bacteria. No results were ever released, and they're reportedly part of the missing files. But one of the physicians who conducted the test was quoted by the Associated Press as saying they'd found lots of chromosome breaks. Embassy staff had to learn this when the rest of us did. In the newspapers, nearly a decade later, the Russians themselves had never admitted the irradiation, and the Schwann guideline has put the American government in an embarrassing bind. In 1976, the State Department gave its Moscow employees a 20% hardship allowance for serving in an unhealthful post and installed aluminum window screens to protect the staff from radiation 100 times weaker than that merely than near many radar bases. That same year, the government gave Johns Hopkins School of Medicine $250,000 to see if there was a link between the signal and an apparent high rate of cancer. In the embassy, which wasn't confirmed, nevertheless, although President Johnson asked Premier Kosygin at the 1967 Glassboro talks to stop the bombardment, Washington has never found any formal basis to demand that it be stopped due to danger to the staff. That was apparently considered an acceptable risk in the protection of the lenient U.S. standard. Invisible warfare. The Soviets had led the way in learning about the risk of electropollution, and as we have seen, they've apparently been the first to harness those dangers for malicious intent. However, the spectrum of potential weapons extends far beyond the limits of the Moscow signal, and Americans have been actively exploring some of them for many years. Most of all the following EMR effects can be scaled up or down for use against individuals or whole crowds and armies. The crudest of these armaments would be sort of electromagnetic flamethrower with a greater range than chemical types. Dogs were cooked to death in experiments in the Naval Medical Research Institute as long ago as 1955, and high-power transmitters using short UHF wavelengths can severely burn exposed skin in seconds. Electromagnetic pulse (EMP) is a term designating the immensely powerful, near instantaneous surge of electromagnetic energy produced by a nuclear explosion. It was first discovered in the late 1960s. The EMP from one detonation a few thousand miles above the Earth would destroy all electrical systems throughout an entire continent. The early 1970s, new types of EMR generators emitted power levels 10 or 20 times higher than ever before were developed in an effort to simulate EMP and help devise communication systems shielded from it. In 1973, these transmitters were described in an invitation-only seminar at the Naval Weapons Laboratory in Dahlgreen, Virginia, where their use for anti-personnel and anti-ballistic missile energy beams were discussed. No information about their subsequent development has been made public, but the difficulties of long-range missile tracking argue that ABM beams haven't yet become feasible. But there are no such difficulties in way of EMR beam weapons for use against unshielded people. At some UHF power densities, there's an insidious moth to flame allurement, which would increase such weapons' effectiveness. As discoverer Saul Michelson described it in 1958, each of the dogs used in his experiments began to struggle for release from the sling, showing considerable agitation and muscular activity. Yet for some reason, the animal continues to face the horn, perhaps as part of the same effect. UH beams can also induce muscular weakness and a lethargy. The Soviet experiments with rats in 1960, 5 minutes of exposure to 100,000 microwatts reduced swimming time in an endurance test from 60 minutes to 6. Alan Frey's discovery that certain pulsed microwave beams increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier could be turned into a supplemental weapon to enhance the effects of drugs, bacteria, or poisons. The calcium outflow windows discovered by Ross 80 could be used to interfere with the functioning of the entire brain. In the early 1960s, Frey found that when microwaves of 300 to 3000 megahertz were pulsed at specific rates, humans, even deaf people, could hear them. Beam caused a booming, hissing, clicking, or buzzing, depending on the exact frequency and pulse rate. And the sound seemed to come from just behind the head. At first, the Frey was ridiculed from this announcement, just like many radar technicians who'd been told they were crazy for hearing certain radar beams. Later work has shown that the microwaves are sensed somewhere in the temporal region, just above and slightly in front of the ears. The phenomenon apparently results from pressure waves set up in the brain tissue, some of which activate the sound receptors of the inner ear via bone conduction, while others directly stimulate nerve cells in the auditory pathways. Experiments on rats have shown that a strong signal can generate a sound pressure of 120 decibels of approximately the level near a jet engine takeoff. Obviously, such a beam could cause human severe pain and prevent all voice communication. The same effect can be used more subtly when was demonstrated in 1973 by Joseph C. Sharp of the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. Sharp, serving as a test subject himself, heard and understood spoken words delivered to him in an echo-free isolation chamber via pulsed microwaves audiogram. An analog of the words' sound vibrations beamed into his brain. Such a device has obvious applications in covert operations designed to drive a target crazy with voices or undetectable instructions to a programmed assassin. There are also indications that other pulse frequencies cause similar pressure waves in other tissues, which could disrupt various metabolic processes. A group under R.G. Olson and J.D. Grissett at the Naval Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory in Pensacola has already demonstrated such effects in simulated muscle tissues. And has a continuing contract to find beams affected against human tissues. In the 1960s, Frey also reported that he could speed up, slow down, or stop isolated frog hearts by synchronizing the pulse rate of a microwave beam with the beat of the heart itself. Similar results have been obtained using live frogs, indicating that it's technically feasible to produce heart attacks with a ray devised to penetrate the human chest. In addition to the methods of damaging or killing people with EMR, there are several ways of controlling their behavior. Ross 80 and his colleagues have shown that microwaves modulated in various ways can force specific electrical patterns upon parts of the brain. Working with cats, they found that brain waves appearing with Conditioned responses could be selectively enhanced by shaping the microwaves with a rhythmic variation in amplitude, height, corresponding to EEG frequencies. For example, the 3 Hz modulation decreased 10 Hz alpha waves in one part of the animal's brain and reinforced 14 Hz beta waves in another location. Some radar can find a fly a kilometer away or track a human at 25 miles, and several researchers have suggested that focused EMR beams of such accuracy could bend the mind, much like electrical stimulation of the brain, ESP, through wires. We know of ESP's potential for mind control largely through the work of Jose Delgado. One signal provoked a car to lick its fur, then continued compulsively licking the floor and bars of its cage. The signal, designed to stimulate a portion of the monkey's thalamus, a major midbrain center for integrating muscle movements, triggered a complex action. The monkey walked to one side of the cage, then the other, then climbed to the rear ceiling, then back down. The animal performed the same activity as many times as it was stimulated with the signal, up to 60 times an hour, but not blindly. The creature still was able to avoid obstacles and threats from the dominant male while carrying out the electrical imperative. Another type of signal has made monkeys turn their heads or smile, no matter what else they were doing. Up to 20,000 times in 2 weeks. Delgado concluded, the animals look like electronic toys.